For 4 years, my family treated me like a ghost. No calls, no apologies. Then, the exact week my company prepared to close its massive growth deal, my mother, father, and brother strolled into my Denver headquarters. They slammed down a file demanding 50% of my business, threatening the reputation I bled to build, but they had no idea that crossing my lobby meant stepping directly into my trap. My name is Marina Ferry. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the air in my top-floor office at Harbor Trace Analytics felt thin, charged with the kind of electricity that only comes before a massive financial close. I was bent over the final term sheets for our second major funding round. Hundreds of millions of dollars were at stake. 4 years of relentless, blood-drawing work were about to culminate in a single, world-shifting signature. My entire life had been compressed into the dense legal jargon spread across my desk. Then, a sharp knock on the heavy oak door shattered the quiet. My assistant, Sloan Mercer, stepped into the room. Sloan was a professional built of titanium, a woman who never appeared flustered, never seemed shaken by the daily chaos of running a rapidly growing technology firm. But right then, her face was entirely drained of color. She closed the door behind her, leaning back against the thick wood as if she needed to physically block out whatever was waiting in the hallway. Her voice trembled slightly as she told me there were 3 people standing in the main lobby. They were demanding an immediate meeting. They claimed to be my family. Just like that, the oxygen vanished from the room. My chest tightened with a phantom grip from a past I had deliberately buried under layers of legal corporate structure and sheer, unyielding willpower. 4 years. For 4 years, they had been dead to me, and I had been dead to them. There had been no phone calls on holidays. There had been no text messages asking if I was alive. There had certainly been no apologies. And now, in the exact week my company was preparing to close the largest growth deal in our history, they had materialized. I did not panic. Panic was a luxury I had permanently left behind in Indianapolis. I stood up, smoothed the lapels of my tailored jacket, and instructed Sloan to hold all my calls. I walked out of my office and took the private elevator down to the executive level. The descent felt like moving through thick water. My mind was racing, calculating every possible angle, but my exterior remained absolutely still. The glass-walled conference room on the executive floor was our pride, a transparent box that overlooked the sprawling Denver skyline. It was designed to make clients feel powerful, to make them feel like they were sitting on top of the world. Today, it held the people who had once tried to bury me in the dirt. I walked through the double doors. The silence inside was absolute and heavy. Sitting around the polished mahogany table were my mother, Lorraine Ferry, my father, Burke Ferry, and my brother, Nolan Ferry. They sat upright, poised, arranged exactly like a corporate delegation arriving for a hostile takeover. There was no sudden rush of emotion upon seeing me. There were no tears of regret. There were no tentative steps forward to embrace the daughter they had violently exiled from their lives. They did not look like a family seeking reconciliation. They looked like predators assessing a meal. Nolan was the first to break the heavy silence. He leaned back in the expensive ergonomic chair, interlacing his fingers behind his head with an air of absolute ownership. He let his eyes rake over the expensive light fixtures, the panoramic view of the mountains, and finally, he let his gaze settle on me. A familiar, deeply arrogant smirk twisted his lips. He let out a short, dry laugh and said that I had not done too badly for myself. I ignored his bait. I pulled out a chair directly opposite them and sat down, keeping my posture rigid and my hands folded neatly on the table. Lorraine did not bother with pleasantries. My mother had always treated warmth as a transaction, and clearly, she felt no need to spend any of her emotional currency today. She reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out a thick, legal-sized file. She slid it across the smooth surface of the table toward me. The paper made a harsh scratching sound against the wood. Her voice was pure ice. She spoke with the flat, commanding tone of a senior executive dictating terms to an insubordinate junior clerk, not a mother addressing her flesh and blood. "Open it," she commanded. I flipped the heavy cardstock cover. The document resting on top was a draft equity transfer agreement. I scanned the dense legal text, my eyes immediately catching on the key clauses highlighted in bold type. It was a demand. They were formally requesting that I sign over 50% of all Harbor Trace Analytics shares directly to Nolan. The justification, printed boldly on page 2, was framed under the grotesque and insulting heading of restoring family interests. I looked up from the paper, letting the sheer audacity of the demand settle in the cold room. They were claiming my entire empire was built on stolen ground. Nolan leaned forward, the smirk now replaced by a mask of manufactured righteousness. He stated loudly that the core technological platform of Harbor Trace was nothing more than a derivative of the internal systems I had developed while working at Ferryfield Services. According to his twisted narrative, I had taken family assets, absconded in the middle of the night, and used their proprietary foundations to get rich entirely on my own. It was a flawless lie, polished and rehearsed to perfection. The system I built for them 4 years ago was a rudimentary patch for a sinking ship. Harbor Trace was a completely different beast, built from scratch on an entirely new architecture precisely because I knew they would one day try this exact maneuver. But truth was utterly irrelevant in this room. They were not here for a debate about code architecture. They were here for an extortion. I closed the folder slowly, keeping my hands perfectly still to hide the slight tremor of pure adrenaline coursing through my veins. I looked directly at Burke, my father, the man who had stood by and watched me burn 4 years ago just to protect his golden boy. I asked him a simple, direct question. Why now? After 4 years of absolute silence, 4 years of letting the entire industry believe I was a thief and a traitor, why walk into my building on this specific day? Burke did not flinch. He looked at me with cold, pragmatic eyes that held zero paternal affection. He laid out the terms plainly, his voice devoid of any hesitation. He stated that if I refused to sign the transfer agreement right here and now, they were fully prepared to launch a full-scale assault. They had drafted complaints ready to be filed with the State Board of Ethics. More importantly, they were ready to send copies of those complaints directly to our lead investors and every strategic client on my active roster. They would publicly accuse me of severe intellectual property theft. They would tie me up in endless litigation, just long enough to poison the upcoming funding round and bleed my hard-earned reputation completely dry. They were holding a loaded gun to the head of my life's work. The tension in the glass box was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Nolan was practically vibrating with eager anticipation. Lorraine watched me like a hawk, waiting for the inevitable crack, waiting for the tears, waiting for the little girl who used to beg for their approval to surrender and beg for mercy. They fully expected outrage. They expected a massive emotional breakdown. They expected me to fight back with raw, unhinged emotion, which would only serve to prove my instability to the watching corporate world. Instead of getting angry, instead of raising my voice, I let out a slow, measured breath. And then I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was a calculated, razor-sharp curve of the lips that did not reach my eyes. I looked around the table, meeting each of their gazes in turn, holding eye contact just long enough to make them uncomfortable. I told them that such a significant claim regarding the foundational assets of a massive enterprise could not possibly be handled informally over a quick meeting. I kept my tone perfectly even and entirely pleasant. I said an accusation of this magnitude deserved to be handled strictly by the book, treated with the utmost professional rigor. I proposed that we schedule a formal due diligence session with my board of directors and independent legal counsel to review their claims transparently and professionally. The shift in the room was instantaneous and utterly satisfying. Nolan blinked rapidly, his relaxed posture stiffening as confusion washed over his face. Lorraine exchanged a rapid, highly uncertain glance with Burke. They had walked into my building expecting a panicked victim, desperate to buy their silence at any cost. They had not anticipated a seasoned chief executive officer warmly inviting them into a highly structured, heavily documented legal arena. In that fleeting second of silence, as they scrambled to process my reaction, I saw exactly what I needed to see. They mistook my compliance for fear. They truly thought they had successfully backed me into a corner. They did not realize that I was simply opening the door to a slaughterhouse, and they were walking right in. 4 years ago. The air did not smell like the crisp, sterile altitude of a modern executive suite. It smelled like damp drywall, diesel fuel, and the exhausted sweat of disaster zones. Back then, my universe was confined to a windowless, humming back office at Ferry Field Services in Indianapolis. We were a family enterprise, though the word family always carried a heavy, unspoken condition. Our business was chaos management. When a hurricane flattened a coastline or a massive flood wiped out a municipal grid, our company supplied the muscle, the heavy machinery, and the logistical support to clear the wreckage. Nolan was the face of the operation. He wore the neatly pressed branded polo shirts, shook hands with local mayors, and smiled for the regional news cameras standing in front of our deployment fleets. He was the golden boy, the charismatic frontman who could sell a sense of security to a devastated town. I was the ghost in the machine. I did not do handshakes or press briefings. I built the architecture that kept the company from bleeding to death. I wrote the code for our internal systems, tracking labor hours, monitoring truck location routes, and cross-referencing contractor invoices to catch the inevitable financial shrinkage that happens when hundreds of temporary workers are deployed into chaotic environments. I was in the middle of a massive system upgrade when the numbers stopped making sense. It started as a minor discrepancy, a tiny red flag in an ocean of logistical data. I noticed a specialized roofing crew logged as working a 14-hour shift in coastal Florida, while simultaneously clocking in for heavy debris removal in a Texas impact zone. At first, I brushed it off. I thought it was a simple glitch, a failure in our mobile location protocol caused by downed cell towers. So, I dug deeper to patch the bug. I pulled the raw, unfiltered data logs from the master servers. I started matching employee identification codes manually, line by line, hour by hour. The glitches did not resolve. They multiplied like a virus. I found duplicate personnel numbers assigned to entirely different names and background profiles. I found heavy equipment rentals billed for massive excavators that our own internal tracking showed had not moved an inch from our Indianapolis holding lot in over 6 months. And then, hidden beneath layers of convoluted accounting codes, I found the ghost contractors. These were not real companies. They were subcontractor entities with aggressively generic names and post office box addresses that were receiving massive, expedited payouts. They were submitting incredibly detailed invoices for premium hazard pay, emergency hazardous materials removal, and specialized machinery operation. The amounts were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars bleeding out of our operational budget. And these invoices were being rapidly approved by management and paid out almost immediately, bypassing our standard 30-day payment terms. I spent 3 entirely sleepless nights sitting in the glow of my monitors, tracing the routing numbers and corporate registration filings. I followed the digital paper trail through a complex labyrinth of shell companies and blind trusts until it hit a solid brick wall, but I have always been very good at tearing down walls. When I finally breached the last layer of financial obfuscation, the truth was sitting right there, arrogant and unbelievably sloppy. The intermediary companies were all tied back to a single holding account. That account belonged exclusively to Nolan. My brother was not just skimming off the top to fund a lavish lifestyle. He was orchestrating a massive, systematic fraud. He was actively using the sheer, uncoordinated chaos of post-storm recovery efforts to inflate our operational costs astronomically. He was funneling those phantom profits directly into his own pockets through dummy corporations, risking the entire foundation of the business. My initial reaction was not anger. It was a naive, desperate kind of panic. I truly believed this was a rogue operation. I believed that if I brought the undeniable proof to our father, the patriarch who built the company on the rhetoric of hard work and blue-collar integrity, he would scorch the earth to make it right. I gathered every spreadsheet, every timestamp, and every routed payment into a single thick binder. I walked into Burke Ferry's office, locked the heavy wooden door behind me, and laid the evidence on his desk. I explained the ghost payroll. I showed him the forged routing numbers. I waited for the explosion of righteous fury. I waited for him to pick up the phone and call the forensic auditors. Burke did not look at the binder. He looked at me. His face was entirely devoid of shock. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. Finally, he leaned forward, folded his hands over the damning documents, and asked a single chilling question. He asked if I had any idea what would happen to our largest federal contract if this information ever saw the light of day. He was not angry at Nolan for stealing. He was angry at me for looking. Lorraine entered the office a few minutes later. Burke had silently texted her to come down. I expected my mother to be the voice of reason, the moral compass that would correct this nightmare. But when Burke explained the situation, Lorraine did not gasp. She did not express a single ounce of disappointment in her son. Instead, she turned her sharp, calculating eyes on me, vibrating with extreme annoyance. She looked at me as if I had intentionally ruined a formal dinner party. She told me I was being dramatic. She said I was choosing to be technically right instead of protecting my own flesh and blood. She walked over to a filing cabinet, pulled out a stack of papers, and slammed them down next to my binder. It was the quarterly internal compliance certification. She uncapped a heavy pen, held it out to me, and demanded I sign off on the audit. She demanded I legally declare the company records were entirely clean and accurate. I felt the floor drop out from under me. I was not just a whistleblower anymore. They were actively trying to make me a co-conspirator. Then Nolan walked in. He must have known what was happening the moment I locked the door. He did not look guilty. He looked entirely bored. He paced around the room, turning the entire confrontation into a masterclass in psychological manipulation. He laughed at my binder. He told our parents I was simply jealous. He spun a narrative that I was a bitter, isolated drone who resented the fact that he was the one out there talking to the major clients and securing the investor capital. He claimed my data was flawed, a pathetic attempt to sabotage his success because I lacked the social skills to bring in real revenue. The manipulation was so intense, so seamlessly coordinated among the three of them, that for a split second, I actually questioned my own sanity. But the numbers did not lie. Math has no family loyalty. I looked at the pen Lorraine was holding out to me. I looked at the three people who were supposed to protect me, who were currently circling me like predators waiting for a weakness. I refused to sign. I told them I would not put my name on a federal crime. I turned around and walked out of the office. I left my binder on the desk. The retaliation was swift and brutally efficient. By the time I reached my apartment that evening, my corporate network access was locked. The next morning, a courier delivered a heavy envelope from the company external legal counsel. It was a formal threat. The letter accused me of illegally retaining proprietary internal documents and threatened me with catastrophic civil litigation if I breathed a word of my supposedly fabricated claims to anyone outside the building. They did not stop there. The family network is a powerful weapon in the hands of a skilled liar. By the end of the week, my aunts, uncles, and cousins had all been fed the same poison. The official story was that I had tried to extort the business for a massive payout, and when I was caught, I tried to destroy the family out of sheer spite. My phone stopped ringing. The holiday invitations ceased entirely. I was completely excommunicated from the only world I had ever known. I packed my car in the dead of night. I drove out of Indianapolis with a ruined reputation and a completely shattered understanding of my own bloodline. For a long time, the pain was a physical weight on my chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. But as the miles of dark highway rolled by, the devastating reality finally settled into my bones. They did not cut me off because my actions had hurt their feelings. They did not erase me from their lives because their hearts were broken by my betrayal. They cut me off because they were hiding a rot so deep it threatened to collapse their entire world. They erased me because they desperately needed a scapegoat. They needed a villain to distract the world from the thief they had actively chosen to protect. They chose the comfortable lie over the difficult truth, and they chose Nolan over me. And in doing so, They taught me exactly how the real world works. I arrived in Denver as a ghost carrying nothing but a suitcase and a deeply rooted sense of survival. The high-altitude air was thin and freezing, but it was exactly what I needed. It was clean. It was 1,000 miles away from the damp, suffocating lies of Indianapolis. I rented a severely cramped, poorly insulated studio apartment above a noisy commercial laundry. My bank account held barely enough for the security deposit and a month of cheap groceries. My only piece of hardware was a bulky, aging laptop that overheated if I ran too many processes at once. But my absolute strictest rule was the one thing keeping me sane. I brought zero data with me. I did not forward a single email. I did not copy a single spreadsheet. I walked away completely empty-handed. The only things I brought to Colorado were my mind, my bitter experience, and a burning, singular focus. I refused to let my past own even a fraction of my future. Survival meant grinding through a punishing daily routine. When the sun was up, I sold my brain to anyone who needed to find missing money. I took exhausting, short-term freelance contracts, working alongside aggressive labor law firms that were building massive wage theft cases. I embedded myself with exhausted human resources audit teams, trying to make sense of chaotic payrolls. I contracted with mid-sized regional businesses that were bleeding tens of thousands of dollars every month to invisible time fraud and operational leaks. I became a highly paid mercenary for the truth. Every chaotic payroll system I untangled, every false invoice I traced back to a phantom vendor, taught me exactly how modern corporate theft operated. I studied the anatomy of the lies people told on paper. When the sun set and the commercial laundry machines downstairs finally stopped vibrating the floorboards, my real work began. The nights were sacred. They belonged solely to the creation of my weapon. I sat at a cheap plastic folding table under a flickering overhead light, rewriting an entirely new software platform from the absolute ground up. The mental discipline required was agonizing. I had to consciously force myself not to take the easy routes, not to employ the familiar logic strings I had used before. I designed a radically different, highly complex cloud-based architecture. I constructed entirely new, proprietary data sets based on the fresh forensic patterns I was discovering during my daily mercenary work. My guiding philosophy was fueled by a healthy protective paranoia. I coded every single module with the constant, looming assumption that one day, incredibly expensive and hostile corporate attorneys would tear my software apart, looking for a stolen fingerprint. I ensured that not one single line of code, not one algorithm, not one database structure could ever be legally claimed as the property of my former life. It was pristine. It was mine. Slowly, out of the exhaustion, the isolation, and the endless strings of syntax, the product began to take a solid shape. I named it Harbor Trace Analytics. It was not merely a logistical tracking tool. It was a digital lie detector, a predatory algorithm built specifically to hunt. It was engineered to detect systemic labor fraud, expose gaping loopholes in complex payment chains, and flag microscopic operational discrepancies hidden within massive multi-location enterprises. My first monumental breakthrough occurred 8 months into the build. A massive Midwestern logistics group was on the very brink of catastrophic financial failure. They were about to lose over $3 million to a highly sophisticated, deeply embedded timekeeping manipulation ring, and their internal auditors were completely blind to the mechanism. They were desperate. I managed to secure a meeting and convince them to let me deploy a beta version of Harbor Trace across their network. Within 48 hours, my system achieved what their entire accounting department could not do in a year. The software isolated the exact digital terminals where the fraudulent punches were originating, mapped the shadow network of ghost shifts, and handed their executive team a mathematically flawless, undeniable prosecution file. I saved them millions of dollars in a single weekend. In the tight-knit, highly paranoid world of corporate risk management and enterprise insurance, a victory of that magnitude is louder than any expensive marketing campaign. The good word spread like a wildfire fueled by gasoline. As the contracts began to multiply rapidly, I realized I needed to build a permanent structure around the software. I needed a team. But my philosophy for hiring had been permanently scarred and reshaped by my own bloodline. I had zero patience for charismatic visionaries. I felt nothing but intense suspicion toward people who sold confidence with an empty, polished smile. I actively recruited individuals who worshipped at the altar of verifiable evidence. I wanted people who believed in ironclad records, rigid processes, and absolute transparency. That was how I found Simone Keats. She was a brilliant, completely unyielding corporate attorney who had recently walked away from a massive, prestigious firm because she absolutely despised settling cases when the opposing side was clearly lying. She possessed a mind like a steel trap and a moral compass that pointed strictly to the truth. She became my general counsel. Shortly after, I brought on Reed Mercer to serve as my chief financial officer. Reed was a man who treated an unverified, undocumented expense report like a deep personal insult. He saw numbers as the only true universal language. Alongside Simone and Reed, I hired a core group of early managers who possessed an almost fanatical, unwavering loyalty to the truth. We were not simply building a profitable tech startup. We were constructing a heavily fortified, intellectual fortress. The culture we built inside Harbor Trace was the exact, calculated antithesis of the toxic, secretive environment I had barely escaped. I built my company on the solid foundation of everything I had been desperately denied in my youth. Within my walls, every single decision, no matter how small, was meticulously documented and archived. Every bold claim made in a strategy meeting had to be immediately backed by hard, irrefutable data. Every ounce of power or authority carried a transparent, highly auditable paper trail. There were no closed-door handshakes to cover up mistakes. There were no silent agreements to protect a fragile ego. There were absolutely no family secrets. We operated exclusively in the brutal, cleansing, and unforgiving light of absolute accountability. Over the course of 4 grueling, transformative years, that relentless discipline forged Harbor Trace into an absolute powerhouse within the industry. We evolved rapidly from a scrappy, desperate startup into the undisputed gold standard for enterprise risk and fraud analytics. We became the exact name that massive growth funds, private equity firms, and multinational insurance corporations desperately wanted to partner with. This incredible momentum brought us exactly to this current, critical juncture. We were merely days away from officially closing a monumental, industry-defining partnership with Vantage Allied, a deal that was being heavily backed by the enormous, intimidating war chest of Crown Meridian Capital. The valuation was staggering. The market implications were massive. Looking back at the 3 people sitting across the glass table from me in my boardroom, the timeline of their sudden arrival snapped into perfect, terrifying focus. Their appearance after 48 months of absolute, punishing silence was not some tragic, delayed emotional epiphany. They did not suddenly miss their daughter or long for their sister. They had simply read the financial press. They knew all about the impending Crown Meridian deal. Their arrival in Denver, heavily armed with draft equity demands and bold threats of intellectual property theft, was not a clumsy attempt at a family reunion. It was a highly calculated, meticulously timed, and entirely predatory corporate attack. It was designed specifically to hijack the massive empire I had built entirely from the ashes they had intentionally left behind. Simone Keats, my general counsel, had been standing quietly by the frosted glass wall, observing the entire exchange like a hawk watching mice. When I proposed the formal board review, I reached across the mahogany table and pulled the thick dossier from Lorraine. I handed it directly to Simone. She did not say a single word to my family. She simply opened the heavy cardstock cover and began dissecting the paper stack right in front of them, her eyes scanning the paragraphs with the cold, clinical precision of a surgeon operating on a malignant tumor. This was not an impromptu ambush fueled by bitter resentment. As Simone silently flipped the pages, occasionally sliding a crucial sheet toward my line of sight, the sheer depth of their strategy became painfully evident. They had not just brought a list of grievances, They had manufactured an entire alternative reality designed to exert maximum legal pressure. The file was meticulously organized, stuffed with grainy, printed screenshots of legacy user interfaces from the old disaster response system I had built. There were dozens of pages detailing operational process descriptions from my time in Indianapolis, all heavily redacted to remove any context of their own massive fraud. They had even included fragmented, printed emails I had sent years ago, carefully cropping out the dates and the recipients to stitch together a completely fabricated narrative of deliberate corporate theft. But the most staggering part of their attack was not the fake history, it was the absolute greed of their terms. I read the secondary clauses Simone silently tapped with her manicured fingernail. Their demand did not stop at 50% of the total equity in Harbor Trace Analytics. They wanted to swallow the company from the inside out. The draft agreement included a binding stipulation granting Nolan a permanent, unassailable seat on my board of directors. For Burke, they had drawn up a mandatory, multi-year executive consulting contract that guaranteed him an outrageous annual retainer for providing absolutely zero actual services. And for Lorraine, the architect of this extortion, they demanded a newly invented executive position possessing the ultimate right of strategic direction, which would effectively give her veto power over my entire corporate roadmap. If I refused to sign their extortionate terms today, the final page of the dossier outlined their immediate retaliation. They had a draft motion ready to be filed in federal court by the close of business, seeking an emergency injunction against my firm. This injunction was explicitly engineered to legally freeze the massive capital injection we were about to receive from Crown Meridian Capital. Furthermore, Burke leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and made it perfectly clear that a highly curated version of this stolen intellectual property narrative would be simultaneously leaked to the major financial press outlets. They understood exactly how the capital markets operated. The markets absolutely despised risk and uncertainty. A mere whisper of a foundational intellectual property lawsuit would send our elite investors running for the exits, collapsing my valuation overnight. I kept my face completely blank, projecting absolute boredom as I pulled the stack of exhibits closer to me. I slowly turned the pages, projecting the image of an executive mildly inconvenienced by a frivolous lawsuit. Then, I saw it. It was buried near the back of the second section, slipped discreetly between two completely innocuous pages of dense technical schematics. It was a standard intellectual property assignment agreement. The document bore the familiar, heavy letterhead of Ferryfield Services, and there, resting perfectly on the bottom signature line, was my name. The air in my lungs instantly turned to solid ice. My heart stopped beating for one agonizing second before kicking into a violent, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I stared at the black ink. The loops and angles looked exactly like my signature, but its existence was an absolute, physical impossibility. I let my eyes dart to the date typed neatly at the top right corner. The document claimed I had officially signed over all developmental rights to my underlying code on the 14th of November. That date was exactly 4 months after I had packed my car, driven out of Indianapolis, and completely severed all contact with them. I did not gasp. I did not allow my fingers to tremble. I kept my breathing slow, shallow, and completely even. I let my eyes trace the physical edges of the paper. The document itself looked far too pristine. The margins were incredibly sharp, the white paper completely unblemished by the slight yellowing or the minor warping that inevitably happens to archived legal files sitting in a humid storage cabinet for years. I quickly committed the name of the notary public stamped right next to my forged signature perfectly to memory. I knew, with absolute terrifying certainty, that I was holding a fabricated piece of evidence. They had forged a federal legal document, Nolan, interpreting my prolonged silence as a paralyzing wave of defeat, leaned across the table. He let out a loud, condescending sigh, spreading his hands wide. He told me there was absolutely no need to make this process ugly or drawn out. He puffed out his chest and declared that the family was simply reclaiming the legacy that rightfully belonged to them. He flashed that familiar, empty salesman smile, and urged me to just sign the papers so we could all move forward as a united, profitable front. I looked up from the forged document, meeting his arrogant gaze with eyes as dead and cold as winter soil. I closed the file, the heavy cover making a sharp smack against the wood, and handed it back to Simone. I told him calmly that I had already given them my answer. I reiterated that a demand involving 50% equity and sweeping board control would never be signed in a casual afternoon meeting. I firmly stated that we would proceed with a formal, fully recorded due diligence hearing on Friday morning. I told them I would assemble my entire board of directors, my independent legal advisors, and our chief financial officer to thoroughly examine every single page of their claim, under oath, on the official corporate record. I fully expected immediate resistance. I expected Burke to slam his fist on the mahogany, or Nolan to angrily threaten the immediate filing of the injunction to break my nerve. Instead, Lorraine spoke up. She agreed instantly. Her voice was sharp, decisive, and completely bypassed the aggressive posturing of the men beside her. She stated that Friday morning would be perfectly acceptable to their legal team. Her immediate capitulation was the most revealing. Fatal mistake of the entire afternoon. It was a glaring, flashing red light in the dark. A confident party, secure in their legal standing, would never agree to step onto their opponent's home turf, surrounded by hostile, highly paid corporate attorneys, without a massive, drawn-out fight. Lorraine had agreed far too quickly. She was willing to play on a fully regulated, highly dangerous field because she was completely out of time. She did not care about the venue as long as the transfer of power or the financial payout arrived before the clock ran out. They stood up to leave, gathering their expensive designer coats and leather briefcases with an air of artificial, manufactured triumph. They truly believed they had successfully forced my hand and dragged me to the negotiating table. As Nolan reached for the heavy chrome handle of the glass door, his sheer arrogance finally betrayed his intelligence. He turned his head slightly over his shoulder, offering one final, smug parting shot. He told me to make sure my board was ready to play ball on Friday, because the other side needed a definitive, binding answer by the end of the week. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind them, sealing the silence in the boardroom. The other side. Those 3 words hung suspended in the quiet, sterile air. Nolan had just casually handed me the final, missing piece of the entire puzzle. They were not here out of a distorted sense of family honor. They were not here to settle an old grudge, and they certainly were not here to reclaim a legacy they genuinely believed I had stolen. They were here because they owed a massive debt to someone else. 50% of Harbor Trace Analytics was not a corporate trophy they wanted to proudly mount on their wall. It was a desperate, sinking life raft. There was a massive, gaping financial hole drowning their entire operation back in Indianapolis, and a ruthless third party was demanding immediate payment. They had walked into my headquarters attempting to execute a hostile takeover, completely and utterly unaware that they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them permanently. The moment the heavy glass door clicked shut and my family disappeared into the elevator bank, the sterile air in the boardroom seemed to instantly depressurize. I did not waste a single second on taking a deep, emotional breath. There was absolutely no room for sentimentality, only structural defense. I turned to Simone. I told her we needed to establish a completely isolated war room immediately. Within 10 minutes, I had ordered my security team to lock down the entire executive floor. I formed a heavily restricted, airtight investigative unit consisting of exactly 3 people besides myself. Simone was tasked with mapping out the exact legal threat architecture they were trying to build. Reed Mercer, my meticulous chief financial officer, was handed the job of tearing apart their underlying financial reality. And the final, most crucial addition was Leah Crow. Leah was our lead forensic data investigator. She was a woman who treated hidden digital metadata like a native language. She possessed the terrifying ability to track a supposedly deleted file through a dozen layers of encrypted remote servers and pinpoint the exact physical keyboard that had typed the initial keystroke. I briefed the 3 of them on the extortion attempt, handed over the scanned copies of the dossier, and unleashed them. We began the dig. Reed started his surgical strike by pulling the public corporate filings, uniform commercial code records, and state tax liens for ferry field services. What he uncovered within the first hour was not the profile of an aggressive company attempting to reclaim a highly valuable lost asset. He found a decaying financial corpse being propped up by incredibly desperate, highly illegal accounting maneuvers. Reed projected his rapidly accumulating findings onto the massive smart screen dominating the war room. Ferry Field Services was actively drowning in an ocean of red ink. They had massive hanging tax liabilities stretching back over 36 months. They were currently violating the core financial covenants of their primary surety bonds, a fatal error which meant they were legally barred from bidding on any new municipal or federal disaster recovery contracts. Without new contracts, their revenue stream was completely severed. Worse, Reed found active repossession warnings attached to a significant portion of their heavy equipment fleet. The excavators and loaders that formed the backbone of their operation were about to be seized by aggressive creditors. They were completely starved for cash, suffocating under the weight of their own systemic mismanagement. Leah took a completely different, highly creative direction. She bypassed the decaying shell of the old family company entirely and focused her crosshairs strictly on my brother. She started hunting for the digital footprint of a new venture Nolan had recently launched, a heavily marketed enterprise called StormGrid Response. Leah used a series of specialized penetration tools to crack a slightly secured, poorly coded investor portal associated with his new brand. She systematically pulled down his current presentation materials and highly confidential pitch decks. She isolated a specific slideshow dated from just 6 weeks ago and threw it onto the main screen next to Reed's financial autopsy. Slide number 12 was an absolute revelation. It stated explicitly, in bold, arrogant typography, that StormGrid Response was currently in the final stages of a massive strategic merger with Harbor Trace Analytics. Nolan had literally embedded my proprietary company logo directly into his fraudulent pitch deck. He had confidently stood in front of rooms full of wealthy angel investors and venture capitalists, explicitly promising them that his family already owned my foundational technology platform. He assured these investors that a formal unification of our assets was completely imminent. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his strategy was breathtaking. Nolan was not just trying to extort me to quickly pay off an impending family debt. He had already gone out and aggressively pre-sold a highly lucrative future that he did not possess even a fraction of a right to promise. He was actively using the phantom promise of securing 50% of my carefully built equity to secure fresh, multi-million-dollar capital injections for his own failing, empty shell of a startup. Then, Leah turned her intense, undivided attention to the digital copy of the intellectual property assignment document. This was the exact paper Simone had covertly scanned from the dossier during the meeting, the one bearing my supposedly legitimate signature. Leah ran the high-resolution file through our proprietary forensic extraction architecture to peel back the invisible layers of its creation history. The printed document boldly claimed to be from years ago, but the embedded digital metadata told a completely different, highly incriminating story. The file had absolutely not been created in the past. The encrypted timestamps proved undeniably that the document had been initially generated exactly 19 days ago. Furthermore, the digital footprint showed the document was authored and saved on a specific hardware device that was actively logged into an executive administrative account belonging directly to the StormGrid Response internal network. Nolan had personally sat at his desk and drafted his own fake, highly illegal evidence. Simone took the forensic analysis one fatal step further. Focusing her legal expertise on the blue notary public seal stamped prominently right next to my forged signature, she pulled up the official state licensing registry on her tablet. The result was instantaneous and devastating. The specific notary whose name, signature, and unique registration number appeared on that fraudulent paper had allowed their official state commission to expire completely. The expiration date was exactly 14 months before the date the document was supposedly notarized. The seal was legally dead. By physically bringing that specific piece of paper into my office and presenting it as a binding demand, My family had crossed a massive, uncrossable boundary. They had moved out of the realm of a hostile civil dispute and stepped straight into the highly penal territory of federal document forgery and criminal corporate fraud. I needed to ensure our defensive perimeter was completely impenetrable. I logged into my deeply encrypted, offline personal archives. I ran a targeted search and retrieved the exact original email I had sent directly to Burke and Lorraine on the incredibly bitter night I had walked away from Indianapolis. The text of the message was brief, entirely cold, and legally absolute. In that email, I had explicitly and formally stated that I would not sign any compliance acknowledgments, nor would I ever authorize any transfer of assets, intellectual property, or liability waivers at any point after my final hour of employment. That single, time-stamped communication instantly vaporized any potential, convoluted argument they could ever attempt to make about a delayed, verbal, or retroactive assignment agreement. The final, devastating piece of our rapidly assembling counterattack came from our own building infrastructure. My director of physical security sent a highly encrypted, enormous video file directly to the war room server. The high-definition audio-visual recording system, which was installed completely discreetly within the architectural framework of our main lobby, had captured every single second of their initial arrival. We now possessed pristine, crystal-clear audio of Lorraine coldly demanding 50% of my company. We had high-definition video of Burke aggressively threatening to leverage my elite investors against me. And we had perfectly isolated audio of Nolan openly and arrogantly confirming their calculated intent to completely destroy the pending Vantage Allied deal if I did not immediately submit to their extortion. They had brazenly handed me their entire criminal plot on a silver platter, perfectly recorded, completely unaware that Harbor Trace monitored its own physical perimeter just as aggressively and ruthlessly as it monitored its clients' digital data. Reed looked at me across the table, his face tight with intense anticipation, his hands resting flat on the wood. He asked if we were preparing to send the forgery evidence and the extortion recordings to the federal authorities and the state attorney general immediately. Simone had her hand hovering over her mobile phone, entirely ready to draft the legal kill shot and end the threat right there in the room. I looked at the damning evidence glowing on the screens around us, feeling a profound, heavy silence settle over my mind. I shook my head slowly. I told them to hold absolutely everything. Executing a premature strike, launching an immediate, overwhelming legal counterattack right now, would be a massive tactical error. It would only make them panic, realize their catastrophic exposure, and scramble frantically back into the shadows. They would immediately retract the forged document, desperately claim it was a terrible administrative error made by a rogue, incompetent paralegal, and then find another, far more insidious, invisible way to bleed my company slowly over the coming years. I absolutely did not want them to retreat. I wanted them to feel utterly and completely invincible. I wanted them to walk blindly into the Friday morning board meeting entirely convinced that they held all the power in the room. I wanted them to step fully, confidently, and arrogantly into the blinding light, where every single lie they had ever told would be permanently, inescapably recorded on the official, unforgiving corporate record. The Denver skyline was a grid of cold, unblinking lights outside my office window when I convened the Emergency Corps leadership meeting. It was nearly 11 o'clock at night. The high-altitude air conditioning hummed a low, steady drone in the background. Around the heavy conference table sat Simone Keats, Reed Mercer, and 3 of my most trusted independent board directors. I had presented them with the raw, unfiltered reality of the afternoon extortion attempt. I laid out the forged intellectual property assignment, the secretly recorded threats, and the rapidly decaying financial state of Ferry Field Services. I made the overarching risk absolutely clear. If we simply swatted this attempt away or ignored them, my family would just retreat into the shadows and wait. They would reemerge like a chronic, wasting disease every single time Harbor Trace prepared to take a significant step forward. They would threaten our initial public offering. They would threaten future acquisitions. They would permanently hold my legacy hostage. Anxious murmurs rippled across the far end of the table. One of my senior board members, a veteran venture capitalist who prioritized smooth transactions over absolute justice, immediately suggested a quiet, sealed financial settlement. He leaned forward, tapping his expensive pen against the leather blotter, and argued that we should simply pay them a few $1,000,000 to disappear. He insisted that we needed to draft an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and bury the entire dispute before the upcoming Friday deadline. His logic was entirely driven by market fear. He stated bluntly that the corporate markets hated noisy, dramatic lawsuits significantly more than they hated quiet, hidden lies. He was terrified that Crown Meridian Capital would pull their massive funding commitment at the very first cent of a foundational intellectual property dispute. I rejected his proposal before the echo of his voice had even faded from the room. I locked eyes with him and stated unequivocally that a company whose entire foundational business model was built on selling truth, verifying data, and exposing corporate fraud could absolutely not save itself by paying a ransom for a fabricated lie. Paying them off would fundamentally destroy the very moral architecture of Harbor Trace. It would signal to the market that our integrity had a price tag. I told the board that we were not going to run, we were not going to settle, and we were certainly not going to hide. We were going to dismantle their leverage permanently. That was when Reed Mercer took control of the main projection screen. While the rest of us had been debating philosophy, my chief financial officer had been ruthlessly hunting through the murky secondary markets of corporate distress. Reed pulled up a highly convoluted, heavily redacted financial portfolio. He explained that Ferry Field Services was not just slightly behind on their operational bills. They were teetering on the absolute edge of a catastrophic, terminal default. Their largest institutional loan, a massive credit facility that essentially kept their heavy machinery fleets running, had been bundled up and quietly pushed onto the distressed debt market by their original banking institution. The bank knew my family was about to violently breach dozens of mandatory financial covenants, and they were actively trying to sell off the toxic paper to a specialized special credit unit at a severe, punishing discount just to cut their losses. Reed looked directly at me, his eyes gleaming with the cold, calculating thrill of a perfectly executed financial ambush. He suggested an incredibly bold, almost dangerously aggressive maneuver. He proposed that we buy that exact, specific debt. We would purchase the chains that were currently choking my family. Simone instantly jumped in, her legal mind rapidly building the necessary structural guardrails around Reed's aggressive strategy. She warned the room that Harbor Trace Analytics could absolutely not be the purchasing entity. Using corporate funds to buy a personal enemy's debt would immediately pierce the corporate veil, invite massive shareholder lawsuits, and trigger catastrophic regulatory investigations regarding gross conflicts of interest. However, she noted with a sharp, predatory smile, that restriction only applied to the company itself. She pointed out that I maintained a completely separate, entirely private legal holding entity named Morrow Peak Holdings. I had established Morrow Peak years ago strictly to manage my personal wealth and independent investments, entirely segregated from the operational finances of Harbor Trace. Simone confirmed that we could execute the debt purchase entirely legally and ethically, provided we maintained an absolute, impenetrable firewall of interest. We had to file all the required transparent disclosures. We could not use a single dollar, a single server, or a single employee of Harbor Trace to facilitate the transaction. If Morrow Peak Holdings bought the distressed debt on the open secondary market, it was simply a private investor capitalizing on a highly lucrative, distressed financial asset. I authorized the purchase immediately. I did not make the decision out of a fiery, emotional need for petty revenge. Vengeance is a messy, unpredictable emotion that clouds judgment and leads to fatal errors. This was purely about strategic disarmament. My family had walked into my building wielding their desperate financial ruin as a weapon, believing they could force me to hand over 50% of my life work just to prevent them from drowning. By purchasing their primary debt, I was not just taking their weapon away, I was taking ownership of the exact deep water they were drowning in. I was actively stripping away the only remaining leverage they believed they possessed, which was their ability to compel me through the sheer, chaotic force of their own desperation. While Reed immediately initiated the highly complex, rapid wire transfers through my private bankers to secure the debt purchase, Simone began quietly assembling the audience for the final act. We were going to give my family exactly what they had demanded. We were going to host a formal strategic partner due diligence session on Friday morning. However, my family firmly believed this meeting would be a quiet, humiliating surrender ceremony where I would hand over my equity behind closed doors. They were entirely wrong. Simone drafted highly confidential, extremely urgent invitations. She reached out to Victor Hale, the senior managing director representing the distressed credit facility that currently owned the Ferry Field Services loan. She formally invited the lead observation team and the senior risk analysts from Crown Meridian Capital. She summoned our own external independent legal advisors and the entire Harbor Trace board of directors. We were packing the boardroom with the most ruthless, observant, and powerful financial players in the region. As the meeting drew to a close and the board members began to pack their briefcases, I stood at the head of the table and laid down the absolute, unbreakable rules of engagement for Friday morning. I looked at Simone, Reed, and Leah. I told them there would be absolutely no shouting, there would be no dramatic pointing of fingers. There would be no heated, emotional arguments about the past, and there would be no soft, vulnerable reminiscences about family history. Emotion was the currency my parents and my brother traded in, because emotion could be manipulated. We were going to operate on an entirely different, untouchable plane. I told my team that every single strike we made would be delivered via a certified document. Every single counterattack would be grounded in a verified digital timestamp. Every single fatal blow would be a recognized signature on a legally binding piece of paper. We were going to let them walk into that room, take the stage, and tell their magnificent, towering lies to an audience of elite financial predators. And then, we were going to systematically dismantle their entire existence without ever raising our voices. We were going to execute a corporate slaughter with terrifying surgical precision. The trap was fully set. The structure was perfectly aligned, and all we had to do now was wait for them to walk through the heavy glass doors. The psychological warfare began exactly 24 hours after they left my boardroom. They realized brute force and legal threats had only gotten them a scheduled meeting, so they rapidly pivoted to a strategy they knew intimately well. They started playing the roles of a loving, concerned family. It started with my mother. On Wednesday morning, my personal cell phone vibrated quietly on my desk. It was a text message from Lorraine. The tone was sickeningly soft, a massive, jarring departure from the ice-cold dictator who had shoved a legal folder across my mahogany table just a day prior. She wrote that she did not want things to go too far. She casually mentioned a summer trip we took to a lake cabin in northern Michigan when I was 12 years old, recalling how we used to sit on the wooden porch together, wrapped in heavy blankets, and watch the thunderstorms roll in over the dark water. It was a classic, highly engineered Lorraine maneuver. She was wielding nostalgia like a finely sharpened scalpel, attempting to use fragmented, happy memories to completely overwrite her own vicious, undeniable responsibility. She wanted me to remember the mother who held me during a storm, not the executive who forced me to sign a fraudulent document. A few hours later, my father called. I sat at my desk and let the phone ring 4 times before finally picking up the receiver. Burks's voice sounded incredibly frail through the speaker, deliberately stripped of the booming, commanding authority he usually carried in corporate settings. He sighed heavily, a long, rattling breath meant to convey deep exhaustion. He talked endlessly about his rising blood pressure, his failing joints, and the sheer, crushing weight of his advancing age. He did not explicitly ask me to surrender 50% of the company during the call. He was far too cunning for that. Instead, he painted a pathetic, heart-wrenching picture of an old, dying patriarch who simply wanted his children to stop fighting before he passed away. He was desperately trying to pull me back into the comfortable, familiar role of the soft-hearted, compliant daughter who would gladly wear herself down just to keep him comfortable. I saw straight through the manipulation. The emotional pressure was immense, a heavy, suffocating blanket designed to break my resolve before Friday morning, but I absolutely did not cut them off. If I hung up the phone in anger or immediately blocked their phone numbers, they would instantly realize the trap was set. They would understand I was preparing for a war. Instead, I gave them exactly what they desperately needed to hear. I responded to Lorraine with a brief, gentle text saying I remembered that summer at the cabin too, and that I missed the rain. I told my father in a quiet, subdued voice that I was truly looking forward to clearing the air and making things right on Friday. I offered just enough manufactured hesitation, just enough carefully calibrated weakness, to make all three of them completely believe my armor was finally cracking. I let them believe they were winning. Nolan, however, chose a far more arrogant, aggressive, and physical approach to test the waters. On Thursday afternoon, he casually strolled into the ground floor corporate cafeteria of Harbor Trace, as if he already owned the building lease. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored casual suit, flashing his bright, incredibly expensive teeth and turning on the blinding, hollow charisma that had always been his primary weapon in life. I sat in my top-floor office and watched him on the live, high-definition security camera feeds. He seamlessly inserted himself into a group of my mid-level engineering managers who were taking a late lunch break. He bought them expensive coffees, cracked industry insider jokes, and masterfully steered the conversation toward company metrics. He was casually but relentlessly probing for our internal valuation numbers and trying to extract the exact timeline for the upcoming Crown Meridian Capital investor signing. My director of physical security called my private line immediately, asking if he should send 2 armed guards to escort my brother out of the building for trespassing. I told him to stand down and simply observe. I wanted Nolan to feel incredibly comfortable in my territory. I wanted him to feel powerful. I wanted him to talk. And eventually, fueled by his own massive ego, he talked entirely too much. During his charming, informal interrogation near the espresso machines, Nolan casually dropped the name of a highly specialized corporate restructuring firm based out of Chicago. It was a momentary slip of the tongue, a reckless flex meant to make him sound like a highly sophisticated financial player to my engineering staff. But my managers, trained to report any irregular external inquiries, relayed the entire conversation directly to Reed Mercer. Reed instantly recognized the name of the Chicago firm. He sprinted back into our secure war room and tore into the obscure secondary financial databases. Within 2 hours, my chief financial officer uncovered the horrifying, undeniable reality behind Nolan's arrogant slip. The Chicago firm was notorious across the country for handling aggressive, last-minute corporate rescue financing for companies on the absolute brink of total liquidation. Reed discovered a recently filed collateral registry document. In exchange for a massive, temporary bridge loan to keep ferry field services from being shut down by the government, my family had legally pledged their future equity rights in Harbor Trace Analytics as the primary collateral. The demand for 50% was no longer just a greedy family idea born out of entitlement. It was a physical, tradable commodity. They had pre-sold my company before they even walked into my lobby. They had traded my life work, my blood, and my sleepless nights to buy themselves exactly 6 months of survival. If I signed that transfer agreement on Friday, I would not just be reluctantly partnering with my brother. I would be instantly handing half my board of directors over to a syndicate of ruthless, aggressive debt collectors who would strip Harbor Trace down and sell it for parts. The sheer, breathtaking scale of their betrayal required an immediate, completely silent lockdown of my entire operation. I did not make a dramatic public announcement to the staff. I simply tightened the invisible digital and physical net around the entire headquarters. I instructed the system administrators to instantly revoke all generic guest access badges, ensuring Nolan could never casually walk through the front doors again. I mandated that absolutely every single piece of external communication regarding the investor pipeline or the Vantage Allied deal had to be routed directly through Simone Keats for legal review. I completely locked down the highly sensitive financial data architecture across the entire internal network. I installed a protocol where anyone attempting to export a spreadsheet, print a valuation metric, or access the capitalization table would trigger a silent, immediate alarm directly to my personal desktop. The atmosphere inside the executive offices grew incredibly tense, thick with the unspoken anticipation of impending violence. But on the surface, to anyone looking in from the outside, everything appeared completely normal and routine. I was meticulously ensuring that when Friday morning finally arrived, my family would be stepping onto a highly restricted battlefield where they had absolutely zero visibility and zero control. Then came Thursday evening. The sun had completely set behind the Rocky Mountains, and the office was mostly empty, save for the cleaning crews. I was sitting alone at my desk, reviewing the final seating arrangement for the boardroom, when an email notification chimed on my laptop. It was from Nolan. The subject line read simply as, "Revised terms for tomorrow." I opened the attached document. It was an updated, heavily modified draft of the equity transfer agreement. Nolan, clearly emboldened by his successful intelligence gathering in the cafeteria and completely misreading my soft, accommodating responses to our parents, had decided to aggressively push his luck even further. He had drastically elevated the fundamental demand. The document no longer just asked for 50% of the shares under the guise of restoring family fairness. He had quietly inserted a massive, fatal new clause into the fine print. He was now officially demanding absolute, unassailable veto power over any future sale, acquisition, or initial public offering of Harbor Trace Analytics. He wanted the legal ability to permanently chain my thriving, massive enterprise to his sinking, fraudulent ship. He wanted to ensure that I could never escape his control, that I could never sell my own creation without his explicit written permission and a massive financial cut. With that single, incredibly greedy clause, Nolan completely destroyed the final, fragile illusion that this entire ordeal was about family reconciliation or mutual forgiveness. He proved, in black and white ink, that he only viewed me as an unlimited captive bank account to fund his endless, spectacular failures. I sat alone in the dim, quiet light of my office and read the revised veto clause 3 times. 4 years ago. Reading those exact words would have sent me into a blind, shaking rage. I would have screamed at the empty walls. I would have felt the deep, agonizing sting of a sister finally realizing her brother genuinely hated her and viewed her as nothing but prey. But tonight, as I stared at the glowing screen, I felt absolutely no anger. The fiery, emotional resentment had completely burned itself out over the last 3 days, leaving nothing behind but cold, hardened, impenetrable ash. I closed the laptop screen, the soft click echoing in the empty room. I looked out the massive window at the glittering, endless grid of light spread across Denver. I felt a profound, terrifying quiet settle over my entire body. It was not the heavy silence of defeat or the numbness of despair. It was the absolute, perfect, deadly stillness that only appears in the final, fleeting seconds when a hunter watches the steel jaws of a trap snap completely shut around its prey. They had taken the bait. They had committed every single crime on paper. They had proudly documented their own extortion. The emotional performance was officially over. Tomorrow morning, the doors would lock, the lights would come on, and they would finally have to pay the absolute price for their lies. The deepest layer of truth rarely rests with the loudest person in the room. While my brother paraded around my building with his hollow arrogance and empty threats, the real architect of my destruction remained quietly in the background. Late into Thursday night, the investigation took an incredibly dark and clarifying turn. Leah Crow had completely bypassed the surface-level documents my family had provided and dug directly into the deeply archived, redundant digital servers of Ferryfield Services. She was looking for the absolute genesis of the lie. She found it buried in a chain of deleted internal communications from exactly 4 years ago. Leah projected the recovered text onto the main screen in our secure war room. It was a lengthy exchange between my mother and the external public relations consultant the company used back then. The timestamp was dated exactly 2 days before I was officially locked out of the building. The words on the screen were entirely written by Lorraine. She was the one who explicitly drafted the false narrative. She was the very first person to suggest telling our extended relatives, the local business community, and the major clients that I had grown unstable, that I was stealing proprietary documents, and that I was violently rebelling because I was denied a larger share of the corporate profits. Nolan had not invented the smear campaign. My mother had carefully and deliberately engineered it to completely assassinate my character before I ever had a single chance to speak the truth. The immediate question was why a mother would proactively destroy her own daughter with such ruthless precision. Reed Mercer found the devastating answer hidden in the reconciled bank statements from that exact same financial quarter. Just weeks before I initially uncovered the ghost payroll systems my brother was running, Lorraine had secretly initiated a massive wire transfer. She had quietly drained hundreds of thousands of dollars directly out of the Emergency Family Reserve Fund. She did not steal it for herself. She moved the capital to silently cover a catastrophic, highly leveraged margin call on a completely separate, failing real estate investment that Nolan had recklessly managed into the ground. Her secret transfer had left the company operating cash flow completely hollowed out and incredibly fragile. When I walked into the office 4 years ago and flatly refused to sign the internal compliance certification, I was not just threatening to expose my brother for creating fake contractors. I was actively threatening to trigger a full external financial audit. A routine audit would have immediately revealed the missing reserve funds. It would have exposed Lorraine as a corporate embezzler who was illegally using company safety nets to subsidize the endless failures of her son. I absolutely had to be eliminated. I had to be transformed into a bitter, greedy traitor as quickly as possible, so that no one would ever believe a single word I said about the company finances. And Burke knew. As I read the recovered communications, the role of my father finally snapped into sharp, unforgiving focus. Burke was not the mastermind behind the stolen funds or the orchestrated smear campaign. He did not draft the vicious emails, but he was copied on enough peripheral correspondence to understand exactly what was happening under his own roof. He knew my data was completely accurate. He knew his son was stealing and his wife was covering it up with corporate funds. But Burke chose the warm, comfortable blanket of a familiar lie over the agonizing pain of the truth. He made a conscious, cowardly calculation. Facing the absolute truth meant publicly admitting his golden boy was a fraud and his wife was a criminal, which would completely shatter the patriarchal illusion he had spent his entire life building. It was simply easier to let them sacrifice me to save the family image. The emotional devastation of that realization was incredibly heavy, but it was quickly overshadowed by a final, fatal discovery from Simone Keats. My general counsel had been quietly running my Social Security number through a highly specialized, restricted federal banking database to ensure my personal credit was entirely decoupled from their mess. She looked up from her terminal, her face completely drained of any standard corporate detachment. She had found another massive bomb, and this one was significantly more dangerous than the forged intellectual property transfer they had handed me in the boardroom. Simone projected a scanned commercial banking document onto the wall. It was a formal extension of a massive personal liability guarantee tied to the primary credit facility of Ferryfield Services. The document legally bound the signer to personal bankruptcy and severe asset seizure if the company failed to repay its mounting debts. Sitting right there on the bottom line was my signature. But the document had been executed and filed with the bank a full 18 months after I had moved to Denver and cut all ties with them. They had completely digitized my signature from old, discarded employment forms and seamlessly applied it to new, massive debt obligations. My name had been illegally used to pacify their aggressive creditors and keep their sinking ship afloat for years while they actively pretended I did not exist. I was legally carrying the weight of their failures without my knowledge or consent. This massive revelation instantly recontextualized their entire extortion attempt. This was exactly why they needed me to sign the 50% equity transfer so desperately, and why they needed me to cooperate quietly. If I publicly rejected their demands and explicitly proved my signature had been forged to the investors, the entire fragile house of cards would violently collapse. It would not just ruin their pathetic attempt to steal half of Harbor Trace Analytics, A proven forgery on a federal bank guarantee would instantly trigger a massive criminal fraud investigation by the authorities. The banks would reopen every single loan profile, every single debt record, and every single surety bond. My family was not just fighting for a massive payday to get rich. They were fighting desperately to stay out of federal prison. I sat back in my chair, letting the sheer, toxic reality wash over me. For 4 years, I had carried a deep, agonizing ache in my chest. I had spent countless lonely nights wondering how they could have been so tragically mistaken about my intentions, wondering why they chose to believe Nolan over me. The pain I felt right now was entirely different. I hurt not because they had made a terrible, tragic mistake. I hurt because I finally understood that there was never any mistake at all. They knew exactly who I was. They knew I was telling the absolute truth. And they looked me right in the eye and coldly executed me anyway, just to protect their own comfortable, rotting empire. I sent Simone, Reed, and Leah home at 2 a.m. I remained entirely alone in the silent, glass-walled office, surrounded by the towering, empty skyscrapers of the sleeping city. I poured myself a glass of cold water and stood looking out over the dark horizon. In the quiet solitude of that room, I made a conscious, permanent decision. I finally let go of the heavy, exhausting question of why they did this to me. That question no longer held any power, any meaning, or any value. I replaced it with the only question that actually mattered in the real world. How do I end this permanently? I walked back to my desk and opened a completely blank digital document. I meticulously finalized the script for the ultimate meeting on Friday morning. I plotted out the exact sequence of events, treating the upcoming confrontation like a highly complex, incredibly dangerous surgical procedure. I decided I would let them take the floor first. I would let my mother play the tearful victim. I would let my father issue his hollow, corporate threats. I would let my brother spin his arrogant, fabricated lies in front of the most powerful financial players in the region. I would let their grand illusions stand tall and proud in the center of the room for everyone to see. And I would ensure that the absolute, decisive blow only fell at the exact, fleeting minute they firmly believed total victory was safely resting in their hands. The time for surviving their abuse was officially over. It was time to close the trap. Friday morning arrived with the brittle, unforgiving clarity of a winter sun. The grand boardroom of Harbor Trace Analytics was prepared exactly like a high-stakes tribunal, though only my inner circle understood who was truly on trial. The massive mahogany table stretched across the room, flanked by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying view of the Denver skyline. Every leather chair was filled. My entire board of directors was present, seated alongside our external legal counsel and the sharply dressed observation team dispatched by Crown Meridian Capital. Seated near the corner, perfectly still and entirely unreadable, was Victor Hale. He was the senior managing director of the Distressed Credit Facility, the man whose institution previously held the massive debt currently suffocating Ferryfield Services. My internal audit department rounded out the audience, their laptops open and their faces entirely neutral. At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy double doors swung open, and my family made their grand entrance. They did not walk into the room like people attempting a hostile extortion. They walked in completely triumphant, radiating the blinding, artificial confidence of conquerors arriving to accept a formal surrender. Lorraine was dressed impeccably in a dark, structured designer suit, exuding the chilling authority of a wealthy matriarch stepping into her rightful domain. Bert carried himself with the heavy, arrogant posture of the old boss, returning to inspect his subsidiary. But it was Nolan who truly embraced the theatricality of the moment. He strode into my boardroom and immediately began shaking hands with my board members and the Crown Meridian executives. He flashed his brilliant, empty smile, introducing himself as if he were an incoming chief executive officer arriving for his inauguration ceremony. I sat at the head of the table, my hands folded neatly on the polished wood, and watched the performance. I did not offer them a greeting. I simply nodded toward the main projection screen, signaling that they had the floor. Nolan did not hesitate. He confidently took his position at the front of the room, plugging his sleek tablet into our presentation system. The screen illuminated with a professionally designed slide deck, bearing the logo of his failing company positioned right next to the Harbor Trace emblem. For the next 20 minutes, Nolan delivered a masterclass in corporate delusion. He spoke passionately about the Ferry family's shared legacy. He used heavy, impressive buzzwords like the power of consolidation, synergistic growth, and the absolute inevitability of our operations merging. He smoothly painted a picture where his assumption of a 50% ownership stake was not a hostile demand, but rather the natural, highly profitable evolution of my software platform. Whenever Nolan paused to let a particularly bold lie settle into the room, Lorraine would seamlessly interject from her seat. Her voice was incredibly soft, perfectly modulated to sound like a deeply caring mother who was simply trying to heal a fractured family. She spun a beautiful, poisonous narrative. She described their aggressive demand for half my equity as a necessary action to correct a tragic historical misunderstanding. She spoke about the sacrifices the family had made to foster my early talents. She was so incredibly convincing, so masterfully manipulative, that I could actually see a few of the outside legal advisors leaning forward, their expressions softening slightly. If you did not possess the forensic evidence to prove she was a ruthless embezzler, her performance was dangerously persuasive. Burke played the role of the pragmatic closer. He leaned heavily onto the table, fixing me with a stern, authoritative glare. He repeatedly urged me to sign the drafted equity transfer agreement immediately, right there in front of the investors. He stressed that the capital markets absolutely despised prolonged legal conflicts and family drama. He argued that fighting this inevitable transition would only severely damage the upcoming funding round. He was deliberately trying to weaponize the presence of the Crown Meridian team, attempting to turn my absolute silence into a public display of nervous submission. I let them speak. I let them dominate the air in the room for a full 45 minutes. I did not interrupt Nolan when he claimed credit for my coding architecture. I did not correct Lorraine when she fabricated stories about her maternal support. I did not flinch when Burke subtly threatened my corporate valuation. My absolute stillness seemed to fuel them. Nolan grew increasingly cocky with every passing minute, his posture relaxing, his smile widening. He truly believed that the sheer weight of the public audience and the intimidating presence of the investors were actively crushing my spirit. He thought I was paralyzed by the fear of a public scandal. When they finally concluded their presentation, Nolan proudly placed a sleek, expensive pen on top of the draft agreement sitting in front of me. He stepped back, crossing his arms, waiting for his absolute victory. I did not touch the pen. I simply turned my head slightly and looked at Simone Keats. My general counsel uncrossed her legs, adjusted her glasses, and opened a thick, highly organized binder. She did not raise her voice. She did not adopt an aggressive posture. She began her questioning with the terrifying, clinical precision of an autopsy. Simone started with the dates. She asked Nolan to explicitly confirm the exact timeline of the software development he claimed was stolen. When he confidently rattled off a fabricated month, Simone calmly read aloud a verified, time-stamped network log, proving I had fundamentally rewritten the entire database architecture a full year after that specific date. Nolan blinked, his confident smile faltering for a fraction of a second, but he quickly deflected with a vague excuse about overlapping development cycles. Then Simone moved to the digital devices. She directed her attention to the intellectual property transfer document they had submitted on Tuesday. She asked Nolan to confirm, for the official corporate record, that I had personally signed that document 4 years ago in Indianapolis. Nolan puffed out his chest and boldly stated yes. Simone then politely inquired how a document supposedly signed 4 years ago contained embedded metadata, proving it was authored exactly 19 days ago on a computer registered to the StormGrid Response Executive Network. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly. The Crown Meridian executive stopped taking notes and stared directly at my brother. Lorraine shifted uncomfortably in her expensive leather chair, her mask of maternal grace slipping just enough to reveal the cold panic underneath. Burke opened his mouth to object, but Simone ruthlessly cut him off, seamlessly pivoting to the notary public. She read the name and state registration number stamped on their primary piece of evidence, casually revealing to the entire room that the notary commission had expired over a year before the document was allegedly signed. The family began to scramble. They desperately tried to drown the room in loud, overlapping denials. Nolan claimed the digital files must have been corrupted. Burke shouted that my legal team was manipulating the narrative to avoid paying a legitimate debt. Lorraine demanded that we stop this aggressive interrogation and focus on the spirit of family unity. Through all their frantic, rising panic, Victor Hale sat absolutely motionless. The representative of the distressed debt market simply observed the unraveling chaos with completely cold, dead eyes. He did not ask a single question. He did not express any surprise at the allegations of forgery. His absolute, unnerving silence became a massive psychological weight pressing down on my family. They kept stealing nervous, terrified glances toward his corner of the room, acutely aware that the man who controlled their financial survival was watching them completely self-destruct on a highly public stage. Their underlying anxiety spiked dramatically with every passing minute of his stony silence. The tension in the boardroom stretched to an unbearable, suffocating extreme. The air was so thick with unsaid accusations and impending ruin that the entire room seemed to be holding its collective breath. The arrogant conquerors who had marched in an hour ago were now visibly sweating, their backs pressed hard against the wall by a relentless barrage of forensic truth. I decided it was time. I reached out and slowly pulled a thin, unassuming manila folder across the smooth mahogany wood toward me. The slight scratching sound of the paper against the table was the only noise in the completely silent room. I opened the cover, letting my eyes rest on the single, incredibly powerful document inside. I looked up, bypassing my brother and my father entirely, and locked my gaze directly onto the panicked, trembling eyes of my mother. I spoke my very first words of the entire meeting. My voice was perfectly calm, devoid of any anger or sorrow, carrying the absolute, chilling finality of a judge reading a terminal sentence. I said that before we continued to discuss who actually owns this company, I think we should carefully discuss what my family recklessly traded away just to secure permission to walk into this room today. I did not wait for my mother to formulate another beautiful, poisonous lie. I raised my right hand just a fraction of an inch, signaling the lead technician standing discreetly by the audiovisual control panel at the back of the room. The massive presentation screen behind my brother instantly went completely black. A split second later, high-definition security footage filled the entire wall. It was the raw, unedited recording of their initial ambush in my lobby on Tuesday afternoon. The pristine audio system of the boardroom broadcasted Lorraine cold, dictatorial voice echoing through the sterile air, demanding a 50% equity stake. The investors watched in absolute, stunned silence as the screen displayed Burke aggressively leaning over the table, explicitly threatening to weaponize my clients against me. And then came Nolan. His own voice betrayed him perfectly as the recording captured him casually, confirming they would actively destroy my impending Vantage-Allied merger if I did not immediately surrender to their extortion. The polished, united front my family had spent the last 45 minutes building violently disintegrated. Nolan's face drained of all color. Burke sank back into his heavy leather chair, as if he had been physically struck by a heavy blow, before they could even attempt to speak. Simone Keats stood up and formally introduced Leah Crow to the investors. Leah stepped up to the table, replacing the security footage with the stark, undeniable results of her digital forensics investigation. She systematically dismantled their entire legal threat. She displayed the forged intellectual property transfer document and the fabricated personal guarantee extensions side by side. She explained, with chilling technical precision, exactly how both documents had been backdated and fraudulently signed. She showed the undeniable digital routing traces that led directly back to the executive servers of StormGrid Response. She proved my brother had manufactured federal evidence, but Leah was not finished. She advanced to the next slide, bringing up the recovered internal email chains from 4 years ago. The room read the exact words my mother had typed to the public relations consultant. The investors saw the undeniable proof that Lorraine had meticulously designed the campaign to brand me a traitor. They saw the financial ledgers proving she had embezzled from the family emergency fund, and they saw the correspondence proving Burke had chosen absolute silence to protect the cash flow and his golden son. The air in the boardroom was no longer just tense. It was entirely toxic to them. My family was completely exposed, stripped of every lie they had ever told. Sitting naked under the glaring, unforgiving fluorescent lights, Nolan opened his mouth, stammering, desperately trying to construct a defense about corporate misunderstandings. But a new voice cut through the chaos. It was calm, deep, and carried the absolute weight of institutional wealth. Victor Hale spoke for the very first time. The senior managing director leaned forward, adjusting his suit jacket. He addressed the room with the dry, emotionless tone of a banker reading a balance sheet. He stated that Ferryfield Services had formally breached the mandatory covenants of their primary debt facility several months ago. Because of those severe violations, the lending institution had placed the debt on the distressed secondary market. Victor paused, letting the reality of their bankruptcy settle over the table. Then, he announced that as of 8 o'clock this morning, that massive, suffocating loan had been officially and permanently transferred to a private purchasing entity named Morrow Peak Holdings. For a fleeting, pathetic second, a wave of profound relief washed over my brother's face. Nolan let out a sharp, breathless laugh, clearly believing that some generic, faceless vulture fund had simply bought their debt. He thought he had bought himself another 6 months of negotiations with strangers. He looked at Victor and arrogantly stated that his legal team would be in touch with Morrow Peak Holdings by the end of the week to restructure the payments. Victor Hale did not smile. He simply looked at Nolan with absolute, chilling pity. He calmly clarified that Morrow Peak Holdings was not a faceless private equity firm. He stated that the sole proprietor, the absolute legal owner of the purchasing entity, and therefore the new, undisputed owner of their entire corporate debt, was Marina Ferry. The silence that followed that statement was absolute. It was the sound of a legacy entirely collapsing. Nolan's jaw dropped. Burke's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror as he finally connected the pieces. I stood up from my chair at the head of the table. I looked directly into the eyes of the 3 people who had thrown me to the wolves. I told them, my voice perfectly steady, that I did not invite them here to negotiate giving away 50% of my life work. I brought them here to formally announce that as of this morning, I was the one holding the absolute legal power over their entire existence. I owned the mortgages on their storage warehouses. I owned the liens on every single piece of heavy machinery in their fleet. I owned the rights to seize their operating files. I laid my final offer flat on the mahogany table. It was completely ruthless, legally airtight, and non-negotiable. I demanded they instantly withdraw every single fabricated claim against Harbor Trace Analytics. I demanded they sign a binding, sworn affidavit acknowledging that I was the sole, undisputed owner of my company and its underlying technology. I ordered them to completely preserve all internal Ferryfield Services servers to facilitate a massive, impending federal fraud audit, and I demanded they cease all defamatory contact immediately. If they refused a single term, I would foreclose on their entire operation by noon tomorrow. Nolan finally broke. The polished facade shattered, and he exploded into a screaming, chaotic tantrum, slamming his fists against the table, accusing me of destroying the family. Lorraine entirely dropped her mask of power. The dictatorial matriarch vanished, replaced by a terrified, desperate woman. She reached out toward me, crying genuine tears, using her softest motherly voice to beg me to remember that we were blood. Burke did not speak. He just sat frozen, staring blankly at the polished wood, completely catatonic as he realized he had proudly marched into my company to demand half of my empire, only to discover I now possessed the absolute power to liquidate his. I looked down at them, feeling absolutely no triumph, no joy, and no sorrow, just the clean, cold reality of a closed circle. I delivered my final statement without raising my voice a single decibel. 4 years ago, my family cut me out of their lives to protect a lie. Today, that lie walked into my company begging to be saved. And what it meant was not the daughter you left behind, but the person who owns the debt you cannot escape. The boardroom remained completely silent as my security team escorted them out of the building for the final time. The Vantage Allied merger closed successfully 2 weeks later, cementing Harbor Trace as an untouchable titan in the industry, but I did not spend my time destroying my family just for the sake of cruel vengeance. When their company inevitably collapsed under the weight of the federal audits and their own staggering incompetence, I seized the primary auxiliary lot in Indianapolis. I did not sell it. I completely renovated the massive facility and transformed it into a regional vocational training center and scholarship foundation. I named the foundation after my late grandmother, the only person in that bloodline who had ever quietly believed in my potential. I left a standing instruction with the facility administrators. The door to that building, and any future access to my life, would only ever open for my family if they walked through it entirely armed with the truth, not with demands for power. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would love to know where you are listening from. So please leave a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts together. Please remember to subscribe to the Daisy Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so that this story can be heard by even more people around the world.